Thanks as well, Al, for your leadership for RMA and rural communities across our province for the past many years. And we wish you well as you go on to focus back on private life and other ways that you'll serve the community in the future. Let me begin by saying that rural Alberta is the lifeblood of our province. Most Alberta families who live in our big cities are only 1 or 2 generations away from having lived on the farm, lived in small towns like I myself did in rural Saskatchewan. And we must always recognize that a hugely disproportionate share of the wealth and prosperity that Alberta has generated throughout its history has come from rural communities, from our natural resources, of course, from our historic industry of agriculture, but of course, energy and so much more. And we need to remind ourselves of that during this time of great challenge, this time of trial through which we are passing as a province and as a people. We've been hit by what I call the triple whammy. The biggest public health crisis since 1918, the biggest contraction in the world economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the biggest collapse of oil prices, our largest commodity ever. If you just think about that, we went from selling Alberta oil at about $70 a barrel in February to minus $30 a barrel on the futures market in mid-April. And these twin challenges have imposed real pain on many of our fellow Albertans who are out of work, many businesses that are barely hanging on. And all of us know that as leaders, we must focus relentlessly on protecting lives and livelihoods through this crisis and beyond into recovery. Let me begin on addressing the crisis by saying how proud I am of how Albertans have responded to the challenge. And the tremendous spirit of enterprise and innovation, of course, as well, our culture of resilience that we've seen in ample supply over the past 9 months. To give you one example, Alberta managed until recently, to maintain the lowest levels of hospitalizations, infections, COVID-related fatalities of the large Canadian provinces, lower than anywhere in the U.S. and almost anywhere in Europe, with some of the lightest public health restrictions, with some of the greatest emphasis on personal and collective responsibility rather than government micromanagement. And that is a testament to the culture of personal responsibility. I think it's also a testament to the great cooperation between different levels of government. I want to thank all of you as Reeves, mayors and councillors for what you have done to cooperate closely with Alberta's public health officials, with our great Chief Medical Officer, who is a rural Albertan, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, in helping to follow her advice and, wherever necessary, change course to keep people safe throughout the pandemic. Alberta has led Canada and much of the world in the highest relative levels of COVID-19 testing. We've had the largest and most effective contact tracing operation in Canada, with now 800 contact tracers, critical a part of an effective pandemic response. We were well ahead of the curve in the best prepared jurisdiction in North America in stockpiling personal protective equipment and other critical medical supplies. We were so well supplied that we were able to share much of our surplus with other provinces that desperately needed it. We were the first province to roll out a self-assessment tool that helped our public health response. The first province in Canada, I think perhaps the first jurisdiction in North America, to develop our own contact tracing app, Alberta Trace Together. Our health system, AHS, responded with great speed and care to open up thousands of acute care beds and hundreds of ICU beds with ventilator support in the spring in anticipation of a much worse scenario. And they did so without some of the negative consequences we've seen in other jurisdictions. We've had much lower levels of infection and fatalities in our long-term care and senior congregate living nursing homes, and great credit goes to the operators of those homes and the good people who work within them. We've seen the private sector respond to our call in the Bits and Pieces program to help us to onshore the production of critical equipment like ventilators that were produced by a company in Calgary in partnership with the U of C and Suncor, and they've donated 200 ventilators to our healthcare system. And just as you know, yesterday we launched our new travel pilot program, something that we worked with the federal government on for several months, and which now points the way to how we can facilitate safe travel, which will be critical if we are ever to return our economy to growth. But let me just say that we are now facing, of course, a significant wave of new cases, and if they continue in this direction, they will pose a very serious challenge to the ability of our healthcare system to cope. And as Dr. Hinshaw says, we should not fear the COVID-19 virus, but we should respect it. And I want to call upon all of you as community leaders to help us to spread that message. We have seen significant spread in various times over the past 9 months in rural communities. And we have, I think, seen in some communities a skepticism, in some rural communities, a skepticism about the danger that COVID poses. And we need to convey to people that if the current trends continue, we are going to have to move more and more people out of acute care beds, delay more and more surgeries. Those actions will have negative downstream health consequences, which we want to avoid. So please work with us now more than ever to convey those messages, to work with your local public health officials. Now, having said all of that, I am equally concerned about the enormous challenge posed to Alberta's economy with this triple threat. In 2014, before the initial oil price reduction, Alberta's GDP, our economic output, was over $360 billion. By 2019, pre-COVID, that was down to $320 billion. We had seen essentially a 10% reduction in the size of our economy. And of course, during COVID, that the crisis drove our economic output to as low as $300 billion. Imagine that, a 20% contraction in our economy, which helps to explain why, with the exception of Newfoundland and Labrador, Albertans are experiencing the highest level of unemployment. And I think the stats can numbers mask the reality of the number of people who have just quit looking for work and have given up. They've left the labor market altogether. Let me personalize this. I received an email from a constituent of mine in Calgary, Lougheed, a few weeks back, named Michael. And this is what he said. And this is a kind of a cry of the heart that many of you will have heard and recognized in your own communities. Quotes, "I've not had a full-time job in over 2 years. I have a wife and 2 kids, no health or dental coverage, no cash left, and 0 RRSP or pension funds, as I've had to drain this out just to survive. I cannot compete for roles in my professional field or project controls, as there's no capital investment in it at all, and 0 opportunity to change career paths when hundreds of people with experience apply to every position. Over half our people are broke and are looking at poverty and economic ruin as the new normal." Friends, fellow leaders in this province, if there's one thing you want to take away from my remarks this morning, it's this. Everything we do in the time ahead of us must be focused on people like Michael, on returning hope and opportunity to them so they can care for their families. Because if we don't do that, the human costs will be incalculable. We must together focus on preserving, yes, lives, but also livelihoods. And every policy decision that you make, that our provincial government makes, must be focused on that economic imperative. We're not going to get out, even with the very best policy setting, we're not going to get out of the COVID crisis, sadly, anytime soon. We know that this will be with us for some time. But we can, as I always say, first, do no harm, and secondly, do everything within our power to recover economically. And that's why Alberta's government has provided some $14 billion of fiscal action to protect lives and livelihoods through the crisis, including a surge of $750 million in additional resources for our healthcare system, with massive new investments in infrastructure as part of our recovery plan, with deferrals on fees and taxes and student loans, with small business restart grants and self-isolation payments, and so much more. In late June, ours was the first government in Canada to produce a comprehensive economic recovery strategy to get through and past the COVID era. It's a plan to build, to grow, to diversify, and to create tens of thousands of jobs. It begins with the single largest investment in infrastructure in Alberta history, a $10 billion build program this year, much of which is being invested in your rural communities. In fact, disproportionately in your rural communities. The $10 billion, Travis Days won't like what I just said there. The $10 billion build program, we estimate will help to create 50,000 jobs this year and will likely be repeated next year as counter-cyclical stimulus spending on shovel-ready projects that get people to work right now, but also to help make our economy more efficient and productive in the long run. Secondly, the acceleration of the job creation tax cut and our red tape reduction action plan to demonstrate that Alberta is the best place in Canada and amongst the best in North America in which to invest when companies around the world are studying their footprint, their labor force strategy, their cost structure. Right now in the crisis, and Alberta wanted to be on the radar screen when new investment decisions are made, and accelerating our reduction in the general business tax rate was a key part of that. Sector strategies to speed up diversification of our economy from petrochemicals to agriculture, like our $840 million investment with the Canada Infrastructure Bank and a dozen local irrigation authorities in southern Alberta, massively to expand the area of productive and arable land to improve yields, to reduce water use, all of that a huge step forward for rural Alberta. And, of course, fighting for a future for our oil and gas industry, our largest sector, which is why we made the critical investment in Keystone XL, because we, as a province, we sent a message with that investment that we are not going to passively sit by allowing others who seek to landlock Alberta's energy to win that fight. The message we have sent is that we will take control of our own economic destiny. And just as we continue to put maximum pressure on the federal government to build and complete the Trans Mountain Pipeline, we were not prepared to put all of our eggs in that basket. We needed to hedge against that, the risk of delays on TMX or potential interruption of that project, and that's why we made this critical investment in Keystone XL, which has created thousands of jobs in rural Alberta right now, and which is where construction is well underway. And so much more. Now, I know there's been friction this year with RMA on the question of reviewing the linear tax assessment model. And the reason we brought that issue forward is because we have seen many of our, particularly our dry, shallow gas producers, teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. We did see a number of failures last year, and we did not want to end up killing the goose that has helped to lay the golden egg for rural municipality revenues, for jobs, for the local rural economy. And as you know, many of those companies pay more in property tax than they do in every other expenditure. And their property tax assessments were worth, in some cases, more than the entire value of all of their assets. And this was inexplicable, which is why we consulted with you, rural municipal leaders, on how we could find a balanced approach that accommodates your need for reliable revenues with the need to keep those companies alive, employing people, and paying taxes in the future. I want to thank you for your patience, and I want to commend Minister Tracy Allard for her very good work in coming to what I think is a reasonable solution Perhaps not everybody thinks it's not perfect. As you know, these are incredibly complex issues. But we all have to play our part in ensuring a future for jobs in rural Alberta, and that is our goal with respect to linear taxation, while also ensuring your access to reliable revenue. I want to point out that our recovery plan invests disproportionately in rural Alberta, as many of the actions taken by our government have done. We provided rural communities with $150 million to make important upgrades to 57 small-town water and wastewater systems, and $50 million in STIP funding to replace bridges and pave roads across the province. We've also doubled the province's capital maintenance and repair budget, which, again, will help get Albertans back to work on critical projects. That's mainly on highways in your RMs and counties. The recovery plan is also about ensuring that we get projects that are we're building now that help us create economic growth and opportunity in the future as well. We've chosen 10 strategic projects across Alberta to do just that, and 8 of those 10 projects are in rural Alberta. For example, twinning Highway 3 in the Taber area, widening Highway 40 between Grand Cache and Hinton, and investing in the Northern Lights gas co-op. These projects will invest $500 million in our small towns and rural areas over the next 6 years and drive economic growth in those areas for decades to come. I should pause to also say that yesterday we introduced exciting legislation to allow for the construction of a new bridge over the Peace River near Lacrete through a user-pay system that's being encouraged by the local community, finding innovative ways to build a key infrastructure in rural Alberta. So when we combine the supports offered by Alberta's government with the federal government's Safe Restart funding, stimulus for Alberta municipalities sits just under $2 billion. And for those keeping track, that's $821 million to be split between Alberta's largest cities, with $1.12 billion for Alberta's smaller communities, including rural municipalities. At the heart of Alberta's recovery plan is our effort to make this province the most attractive place in North America in which to invest, to create jobs, and do business. And that's, so, as I've said, that's why we accelerated the job creation tax cut. But it's also why we need rural municipalities to work with us on keeping the tax burden down. Let me share with you one story. I was talking to a head of one of Canada's largest commodity companies who told me that he's paying 8 times more property tax for a grain terminal in Alberta than he is in North Dakota. That is inexplicable. And he told me he's not going to invest a dime more in Alberta as long as that continues to be the case. We need to do better. We also need to do better on municipal approvals and red tape. The CFIB used to give us an F. That's moved to a B- on our red tape reduction rating, but we need to do so much more. We've also, as a government, brought in a new funding model that recognizes the unique challenges that rural communities face with respect to delivering education programs in the schools. This means that $129 million more is going directly to small rural schools in this fiscal year, and that's on top of Budget 2020, where every single school division in Alberta saw an increase in operational funding. We also know, of course, about the crisis of rural crime and how it impacts your communities, and that's why we've developed a new police funding model that will inject more than $286 million over 5 years into rural communities. Moreover, we are reviewing plans for an Alberta police force, which will ensure community policing in rural areas that people can depend on, rather than unfortunately, the revolving door that we too often experience with RCMP officers. And we've introduced Rapid Force to put more first responders in rural areas so folks aren't waiting for 90 minutes when they call the police. Rapid Force will put an additional 400 boots on the ground to assist the RCMP and other police services to make rural communities safer. And along with the new police funding model, law enforcement in rural Alberta will go from 1,600 to 2,300 available officers within the next 4 years. Of course, we also have invested historic amounts of money in recruiting and retaining physicians in rural Alberta. I know a major concern of your local governments. We did so by abolishing the cap on the rural and remote northern physician program, We froze liability rates for rural physicians. We increased their on-call rates and created a 3-year program to bring young Albertans back to their home communities after completing med school. This represents an $81 million additional investment in recruiting and retaining rural physicians, of whom there are 800. That's $100,000 per rural physician. And of course, we've done so much more to strengthen agriculture, forestry, and other critical rural industries. So to close, to all of you in RMA, in our counties and rural governments, I'm asking you to join with us in making up a Team Alberta and taking a Team Alberta approach to getting this province back on track and folks back to work. I will just close by saying that rural Albertans have always demonstrated the culture of resilience and innovation that has made Alberta the envy of the world. We need to do that now more than ever. I and our government look forward to working closely with you in the months and years ahead to see that we get through this crisis, protecting lives and livelihoods, and come out of it stronger than ever on the other side as an Alberta that is, again, a land of opportunity, an Alberta that is strong and free. Thanks very much.